This is Mile High.
Do I want to tell the story or do I want to show the message?
You've got a lot of work to do between Mile High.
The time has come where we can know
we have a responsibility, an ethical and moral responsibility.
We have to do it better in order to move people along.
Up, down, inside out.
If you get your mind right, it is not. It is a receiver of thought. Because love is my first technique.
it's now time for the show.
Are we having fun yet? Extremely thrilled that you're all here. Phenomenal group having you all here. You know, I didn't think I'd be doing this. I went up to FOCO Philosophy Night. Who is there at FOCO Philosophy Night, Fort Collins? Let me see you. Stand up, wave your hands. And they were we had stopped having philosophy nights in Colorado. We had them for a long time as a Colorado Chiropractic Wellness Alliance. And then we had stopped having them. And I went up to a philosophy night that was happening in Fort Collins. It was an epoch. Some of you are here. And I saw all the energy of the people that were come together. I was like, why did we stop doing this? And there were things that going on at that time about injections in Colorado and expanding scope. And was not happy about that at all. And a friend of mine was there too, Liam Schubel. Who knows Liam Schubel? Anybody? Just make sure you tell him that I spoke about him. Yes, and when we saw what a mess things was, he said something to me, which was, he said, you've done nothing here. I was like, man, I'm doing so much. It kept me up nights for multiple nights. And I was like, I haven't done nothing. I've done like tons. But that he had a perception that Colorado was a mess and they wanted to expand scope, and that might actually happen. And so at that time, my wife, Rochelle Knowles, was on the state board. And they wanted to expand scope into injections. They wanted to inject healthy stuff. Just healthy stuff. And not other stuff, just healthy stuff. But behind the scenes, we had found out that their intention was to get that right and then get the right to do vaccinations. Okay? And so we said, well, that's not going to happen. And I called every chiropractor I could, emailed, texted them, all kinds of things. And we've got to testify. And only after all that, only one person showed up. Only one chiropractor showed up to testify against the expanded scope. And that got me really upset. So that's why we started Mile High. I said, what do chiropractors go to? I was like, these darn apathetic chiropractors wouldn't go for this. So we'll do a seminar. We'll do a kick-ass seminar, get the best people to it. And then when we have things like this go on, people will show up. They'll know to show up at their state meetings, they'll know to show up at their state boards, and they'll make something happen. So I'm grateful you all showed up tonight, and I want you to, really, wherever state you're from, country you're from, make sure you show up at those things that happen in your state so we can change the direction of the cartel. If you don't do that, the profession is going to continue going towards allopathic. Understand, apathy in chiropractic leads to allopathy. And as I said, the chiropractic profession is about certain values. Now, we're going to be bringing up a gentleman who also stands for certain values. And I had a privilege of meeting Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I went to the Capitol to testify about issues in 2020, and he was there for Bill SB 163. And I was grateful to his testimony. It was phenomenal. It was absolutely phenomenal. First time I had ever heard him. And he's done so much for taking a stand for liberty, followed his family's history of doing that, started Project Watermaker, started Children's Health Fund, wrote the book, The Real Anthony Fauci. I'm sorry to say, I couldn't read it. I got a couple chapters, and I had so much pain and so much anger, I couldn't keep reading. Sorry to say that. I'm going to pick it up again when I have the energy to it, but it was so painful. But he's really an incredible soul, an incredible individual, and has done so much for our values and principles that we share. So please give an extremely warm welcome to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Really, really happy to be here with you. I do a lot of chiropractor gatherings because chiropractors are my kind of people, because the people who are drawn to this field are people who do critical thinking, who are willing to question orthodoxies, and who have the courage to stand up against these orthodoxies. And once you do that once, and you see how orthodoxies function and how how bad ultimately they are for human fulfillment and for creativity and for health, and you can see them everywhere, and you see how they function everywhere. And this profession has long been an embattled profession that has been standing up to the medical cartel for over a century and really defending people's public health. And then I've also benefited directly from chiropractic treatment. I've seen, the miraculous things that happen with good treatment. So during all the time that I worked for Children's Health Defense, our biggest and most reliable supporters were chiropractors, and I go to Cal Jams almost every year and see how wild and crazy they get when they loosen up. Oh, I'm really, really happy to be here with all of you. And I'm going to, I don't talk about, on the campaign trail, I haven't been talking a lot about public health, but I just talked to a bunch of you in another room, and talked about some of the issues I'm doing, that I'm focusing on in the campaign. But Donnie asked me to talk about chronic disease, and that is a big issue. That's one of the issues that ultimately triggered my decision to run in this race, was the chronic disease epidemic in this country that is disintegrating American health right now. And I'll just tell you kind of how I got into this. I started Waterkeeper Alliance. I went to work for a commercial fisherman on the Hudson River back in 1983. We launched a patrol boat, and we began suing polluters. We sued over 500 polluters, forced them to spend $5.5 billion remediating the Hudson. Today, the Hudson River is an international model for ecosystem protection. It's the last waterway in the Atlantic Ocean that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson spawned or inspired the creation of water keepers all over the world. Now we now have, each one has a patrol boat, they have a full-time paid water keeper, and they sue polluters. They do law enforcement. We have 350 patrol boats in 46 countries, patrolling different lakes and rivers and waterways, et cetera, and protecting them. And I began around 2005, a lot of the water keepers in North America and in Canada, the province of Canada and the states of the United States began suing coal-burning power plants and cement kilns for mercury discharges. 2 years earlier, the National Academy of Sciences and the FDA had collaborated on a study that showed that every freshwater fish in North America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. And most of that mercury, the principal source, was coal-burning power plants and cement kilns. And so there was a bunch of different water keepers that were suing them. We had about 40 lawsuits going at the same time. There were a lot of environmental groups that were suing coal plants, but they were suing them for ozone and particulates and carbon and acid rain, and a lot of it. The water keepers were all suing them for mercury. And I was going around the country and talking to large groups of people about the dangers of mercury. And, 1 out of every 6 American women, according to CDC at that time, had dangerous levels of mercury in her core blood, enough to cause permanent IQ loss in their children, and a whole grim inventory of neurological injuries. So we were working on legislation in Canada and the United States, and I began doing these large groups of people, like this size. But whenever I spoke to any group, it was always a group of women that would show up, and they were different each time, but they had kind of the same look. They were very presentable, and they were, very serious people, and they turned out to be very articulate and extremely knowledgeable. And they would always arrive early, sit in the front row, and then when I closed, they would come up to me, and they would say, after my speech, they would say in kind of very respectfully, but also in a vaguely scolding way, and if you're really interested in mercury exposures to children, you need to look at vaccines. And as it turns out, all of these women were the mothers of children who had intellectual disabilities, and they all believed that their children had been injured by vaccines. And I understood, with a little bit of research, that the medical community was saying they were crazy. And they felt, in turn, that they were being gaslighted. But I had a child who had 29 hospital visits, ER visits, by the time he was 2 years old. And he had severe allergies and asthma. He's now 26 years old, and he's, very healthy and very accomplished, but it was touch and go about whether he would even live, because he was allergic to everything. And my wife, I made this observation again and again, that she could tell before there were any physical signs when he was having an attack. She knew it was coming, and she could put her hand on him, and she could know that he was wheezing, and I couldn't. She'd say he's wheezing, and I had no ability I had no sense, even when she told me. She also was incredibly good at identifying the allergen that had triggered the attack. So when these women came up to me and said this had happened to their children, even though all the doctors in the medical community were saying that's impossible, I was not ready to dismiss them, because I saw this gift that my wife had, this maternal gift, that she was right all the time. And I had also worked with commercial fishermen on the Hudson River and recreational fishermen. And I had sued the state of New York time and time again, and I saw again and again and again the bureaucracy and the scientists who work for that agency were wrong about things that the fishermen were right about. At their daily, experience of living on the water and walking in waders and hauling up fish that they had. There were things that they knew that none of the scientists knew. And again and again and again, they were right about it. So although I'm a very science-based person, I also had this idea, this notion that a lot of times people who are dealing with an issue on the front line every day know more about it and have common sense about it that sometimes eludes the scientists. So, but I didn't want to get involved. My family had been involved with intellectual disabilities and the fight for the rights with people with intellectual disabilities since I was a little kid. My aunt Eunice Shriver is also my godmother, launched Special Olympics from her house in 1968. It originally called Camp Shriver, and I would work there every weekend as a kid, as a hugger, as a coach. And then when I was in high school, I spent 200 hours at Wassaic Home for the Retarded, because the care for people. My family wrote the major legislation. My uncle, my dad, my uncle Teddy, who was the chairman of the Health Committee for 50 years in the United States Senate, had funded these programs and had led the fight for rights for people with intellectual disability, for the civil rights battle that took place when they were all institutionalized. My uncle closed all the institutions. And but my family was deeply involved, but it wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to protect water and the environment, work on energy issues. And one of these women came, so I was kind of ducking them. And then one of these women came to my home, found my home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. I had a little bungalow there, and she was a psychologist from Minnesota whose name was Sarah Bridges. Her son, Porter Bridges, had exceeded all milestones, perfectly healthy kid. At 2 years of age, he got a battery of 9 vaccines. And and that night he had a fever, he spiked 104, he had a seizure, and over the next 3 months he lost all of his capacities. His capacity, his words disappeared, and he had about 200 words. He lost his capacity to make eye contact, to point his finger. He began stereotypical behavior like headbanging, toe walking, stimming, etc. And he got the autism diagnosis. She had sued in the vaccine court, and she got a judgment that the vaccine had caused Porter's autism, and she got a $20 million settlement. And she didn't want that to happen to other children. She came to my home, and before she rang my bell, she took a pile of studies, of scientific studies, out of the trunk of her car, 18 inches deep, and she put them on my front stoop, and then she knocked on my door. And when I came to the door, she told me who she was, and she said, these are scientific papers that show the link between these injuries and vaccines, and I'm not going to leave here till you read them. And I was accustomed to reading science from when I was, I wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid. But my job as an environmental lawyer requires me to read. My whole job is about deconstructing science. Almost every case that I've ever brought involves a scientific controversy. And you have to, bring the scientists on, the ones who are the proponents, what we call biostitutes, the ones that work for, the corporations. And then we have our scientists, and we have to direct examine ours, and we have to cross-examine theirs. So you kind of get a PhD in the particular issue of that case, and you have to be able to read science critically and understand the tricks. They say that statistics don't lie, but statisticians do. They also say that statistics are like prisoners of war. If you torture them enough, they'll say anything that you want. And that's what my job is to show where they've been tortured and made to say things that weren't true. And so I read the abstracts on those studies, And before I was, 3 or 4 inches down on that pile, I recognized that there was a huge delta between what the public health agencies and the pharmaceutical companies were telling us about vaccine safety and what the actual peer-reviewed published science was saying. Then I did the next thing that I always did when I encountered a regulatory issue that I did not understand. I called the top regulators. So I called up Francis Collins, and I could get all these people on the phone because of my family. There's 2 institutes at the NIH that are named after my family. And my uncle provided their budget for 50 years. So all of these people would pick up my phone call. And I started calling. I called Francis Collins. I called Marie McCormick, who was the head of the National Academy of Sciences. I called Kathleen Stratton, who was the chief staffer on the National Academy of Sciences, and other regulators. And they did something very weird, which was they could not, none of them could answer my questions. And when I started talking about the science, it became clear to me they were completely not conversant with any of the science that supported their position. They were adamant about their position, but they couldn't cite any studies. And when I asked them about the studies I was reading, they had no answer. And they said to me, all of them said the same thing: you should talk to Paul Offit. Paul Offit, this struck me as weird because Paul Offit is essentially a functionary of Merck. He was a consultant for Merck. His chair at the University of Pennsylvania is funded by Merck. He developed the rotavirus vaccine with Merck and then sold it to Merck for $156,000. And he is a partner of Merck's, although he claims he is not, he is. And he has admitted it in the past, so we have that, right? But it was weird to me because, a lot of times I had questions about science for EPA people when I was suing the coal industry and the oil industry and the chemical industry. And I would have thought it was very, very, transparently corrupt if they said, we don't know why we have these regulations, and you should go talk to the coal lobbyists, right? So that's essentially where they were sending me. And then Offit, I caught in a lie immediately. And he was the guy that knew everything. And I realized that he did know, and he was lying about it. And that then made me angry, and then I kind of started going down the rabbit hole and getting sucked into this world, and it, which turned out to be the worst career decision I ever made. A lot of people liked me before I started talking about this, and then I saw what had happened. What had happened is, when I was a kid, I had 3 vaccines. My kids, by that time, had 72 vaccines that were mandated. They're not they'll say they're not mandated, but they are mandated. In some states you can get religious exemptions. Some states, like New York and California, you can't get any exemption. You can't get a medical exemption. If your doctor tells you, don't take that vaccine, it will kill you, you still got to take it. So, they're mandates. So, but I was fully compliant. My kids were fully compliant. And, but I saw, I then went and said, well, what happened? Well, what happened was, I was raised in the 50s and early 60s, so we just had polio and smallpox. And then they introduced the MMR vaccine in the early 70s, and then they introduced the DTP vaccine, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, in 79. And that vaccine was very reactogenic. It was killing a lot of kids, and it was injuring a lot. So the CDC and NIH were saying publicly that it was killing. The death rates were about 1 in a million. But they believed internally, because we have their documents, that it was 1 in 15,000. And then they did a study at UCLA that NIH funded, and that alarm bells went off because the scientist who was doing that study started writing private letters, correspondence, they didn't have emails back then, to NIH, and we have all of those correspondence now that show that 1 in 300 kids were getting permanently brain damaged or dead from that vaccine. And they did discontinue it in this country. They discontinued it in Europe. Bill Gates gives it to 161 million African children every year. And in 2017, the Danish government and Novo Nordisk, vaccine companies, funded a study by the best scientists on African vaccines, Peter A. Aby, Sigrid Morgensen. These people are like deities and very pro-vaccine. They did the study. They published in January 2017 in eBiopharma, and the lead author is Morgensen. And that study showed that girls who get that vaccine are 10 times more likely to die over the next 6 months than children who did not. And they weren't dying. They looked at 30 years of data. The kids were not dying of diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. They were protected against it. They were dying of bilharzia, anemia, sepsis, pulmonary diseases. Most of them were dying of pneumonia-like diseases. And the vaccine was protecting them against the target disease, but it had destroyed their immune systems, so they could not defend themselves against, other threats. And but this vaccine, it was costing the industry back then. You could sue them. A lot of people were suing Wyeth, which was the major producer, and Wyeth went to the Reagan administration in 1986 and said, we're losing $20 in downstream liability for every dollar we're making in profits. And we're going to discontinue all vaccines, and so is the rest of the industry, unless you do one thing, give us immunity from all liability. And Reagan said, why don't you just make the vaccine safe? And Wyeth said, because all vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. They cannot be made safe. And that phrase, unavoidably unsafe, is in the preamble to the statute, to the VICA, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, and it also is in the Brucewitz, the Supreme Court case, where the Supreme Court says the justification for this, it upheld the law saying vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. You're going to kill a number of people and you're going to injure a number, and they have to be compensated because the vaccines are averting more problems than they're causing, which there's never been a study that's shown that. So, I'd like to see this study, but there isn't one. So they passed the act, and they gave immunity to liability. So no matter how negligent the company is, no matter how reckless, no matter how toxic the ingredients, how shoddy the manufacturing, how grievous your injury, you cannot sue that company for hurting you. And this caused a gold rush, because now you have a product that the biggest cost of every medical product is downstream liability. And so now you have a product where that cost has been eliminated. But there's other things. Vaccines are mainly developed by the federal government, so the companies almost do nothing. And so you have a product that's almost altogether subsidized through development. And then it is the only medical product that does not have to do pre-licensing testing, safety testing. It does efficacy testing, which does not show that it prevents disease. The efficacy testing doesn't do that. They're not giving it to a bunch of people and then seeing if the study group is protected against disease compared. What they do is they look for antibody response. And if they get that, then it's presumed to prevent disease, which is not true. But they don't do any safety testing. prior to licensure. They don't do any, there's not, for every other medical product, there's required a placebo-controlled trial, and they're long enough so that you can spot side effects that have long diagnostic horizons and long incubation periods. But they don't do that for vaccines. In fact, I've said this for many, many years. Not one of the 72 vaccines that are now mandated for children have ever been tested against an inert placebo in pre-licensing safety trials. And Tony Fauci and Francis Collins publicly said I was lying. So in 2016, when Trump asked me to run his vaccine safety commission, which operated for about 2 months between January and March, he made them, before he brought in a Pfizer partner, Scott Gottlieb, to run the FDA, and Alex Azar, another Pfizer lobbyist, to run HHS, and they discontinued the Vaccine Safety Commission after Trump took him $1 million from Pfizer. There's an inaugural ball, but in that period where we were doing it, Trump made Fauci and Collins meet with me, and with Aaron Siri and Del Bigtree and Lynn Redwood. We all went to, you may know those names, but we all went to the meeting, and there was some smart people in that meeting from our side. And I said to them, Tony, I call him Tony because he's friends with my whole family. And I said, you said publicly that I was lying about this. Can you show a single study that's ever been done? And he made a show of shuffling. They had a roller cart with a bunch of Redwell files on it with studies in them. He made a show of looking through those, and he said, I don't have them here. They're back in Bethesda. And I said, well, can you send them to me or send me a link? And he said, yeah, I'll do that. And of course, he never did. So Aaron Siri and I sued him. And we sued the HHS, and they sandbagged us. We said, show us one study for any of the 72 vaccines, pre-licensing study. That's placebo-controlled. And they stonewalled us for a year, and then on the courthouse steps, HHS gave us a letter saying, yeah, there are none. We don't have any. Never done it. So, and you can go look at that letter on CHD's website. So they don't have, they have no downstream liability. They avoid about $250 million by avoiding pre-licensing safety studies. And then they avoid all the money of development because the federal government subsidizes all that. And then they have no marketing or advertising costs, because the federal government is ordering 76 million kids to take this product. So you get that product on the schedule, it's like $1 billion cash for you. So there was a gold rush to put all these new vaccines on the schedule, that many of them most of them completely unnecessary and almost certainly counterproductive in terms of public health. This was 1989 was the big year when they started adding all of these new ones. And they, like rotavirus vaccines and a lot of other products that there was no need for. There was very, very few. I mean, hepatitis B vaccine, CDC told Merck, develop this because hepatitis B is spread through sexual contact and through, the use of shared needles by drug addicts. And they said, develop this, and we'll subsidize development, and then we'll market them to prostitutes and promiscuous, gay men and drug addicts. So they developed it, and guess what? None of them wanted to pay for the shot. So Merck came back panicked and said, what do we do? And CDC said, don't worry, we'll just mandate it for children. So they mandated for every child. Why does a child need this thing loaded with mercury, loaded with aluminum, and you're giving to that child when they're 6 or 7 hours old, and then 4 more shots quickly afterwards. And so all of this started happening in 1989, and all of a sudden we saw this outbreak of chronic disease in our country. And we saw autism rates go from 1 in 10,000 in my generation to 1 in every 34 kids today. And there's lots of studies that show this. And you know what the industry says as well, autism was always here, we just didn't notice it. So that's, you know, missing autism, full-blown autism is like missing a train wreck. It doesn't happen. I was taking care, I was working Special Olympics from when I was a kid. We never saw a kid with autism, never. And we prided ourselves on being able to handle any kid, no matter how, how debilitating their disability. Even kids who were essentially vegetative, we would put them on a little table, a couple of inches off the ground and have them push a sandbag onto the ground and everybody would cheer for them. But we couldn't have handled a kid with autism, with the head banging, the violence, the biting, the tactile and light sensitivities that put them in agony, the gut, aches. We could not have handled it. We never saw a kid like that. And I worked in institutions and never saw it. And I have never seen a man my age with full-blown autism. Never. Not once in my entire life. Where are they? They're not in, there's no institutions for them. That's a huge problem. You don't see men walking around a mall wearing diapers and helmets and nonverbal, non-toilet trained, stimming, toe walking, hand flapping. I've never seen it. 69-year-old men. 1 out of every 34 kids in grade school today looks like that. What happened? Something happened. And so EPA, Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism, and by the way, there's lots of scientific studies that show this is a real epidemic. The California State Legislature ordered the Mind Institute at UC Davis because the industry was already doing its propaganda. Oh, we're just noticing it. It's always been here, and normalizing it and saying the neurodiversity is great, autism is great. A lot of these kids are geniuses. Well, it's not great, but that's what they're trying to tell us. They're trying to sell us that propaganda. California ordered the Mind Institute to tell us, is it a real epidemic? And they looked at school records and came back. Irva Hertz-Pachota was if you want to look up the study, was the lead scientist on that study. But there are many of those studies. It's real, it's epidemic. And Congress said to EPA, tell us what year it started. Well, EPA is also a captive agency. It's captured, it doesn't regulate pharma. So it's captured by oil, coal, gas, pesticide, big ag, et cetera, not by pharma. So it actually did a real study. And that study, they said it's a red line, 1989. Well, 1989, a lot of other chronic diseases started appearing. We started seeing peanut allergies, food allergies, stuff I never saw as a kid, all this entire group of neurological disorders, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette's syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism, all these I didn't know any of them. I never heard of narcolepsy or Tourette's syndrome or tics. I never knew anybody like that. I have 11 siblings, 70 cousins. Never saw somebody with a peanut allergy. Why do 5 of my kids have allergies? What happened? Oh, we saw the autoimmune diseases suddenly appear, juvenile diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, diseases that are now commonplace. We all know. Why do we all know about Crohn's disease? Nobody had Crohn's disease. Lupus, all of this stuff, about 170 diseases suddenly appeared at the same time. And then the allergic disease. I had this son I told you about who's allergic. Anaphylaxis, eczema. I never knew anybody with eczema. And then asthma. My brother had asthma, but he was told by his doctor there'll never be a cure for asthma because it's so rare and nobody will ever study it. now, 1 out of every 8 black kids in our municipal areas has asthma. By the way, because my child had these allergies, I worked with a group of people to start a group called the Food Allergy Initiative. Food Allergy Initiative is to study where the allergies are coming from, because nobody is going to study that. That is career death if you want to study that. What they're going to study is how do we treat them, which everybody likes because it means more money for pharma. So, but it's good for me. For my kids, I want a cure for it. So the way that they study, we hijacked and poached scientists from all over the country who are experts on allergy, and we brought them to the facility in New York, and they started funding allergies. Well, how do you study allergies? Well, you induce allergies in rats, and then you give them different things to try to, to try to alleviate the allergy. How do you induce an allergy in a rat? Here's how you do it. You take the aluminum adjuvant from the hepatitis B vaccine, and you inject it with a peanut protein, and that rat will have a peanut allergy. You inject it with a milk protein, he'll have a dairy allergy. Inject it with a latex protein, he'll have a latex allergy. And all of a sudden, allergies started appearing, when epidemic. And everybody's wondering where they came from. Nobody's wondering, actually. Nobody asked the question, right? Nobody asked that question. So, but there's 2 scientists called Cowlings and Mawson who studied it, and there's a great book by Heather Fraser called Peanut Allergy. What she does, she looks at all of these studies that show that if you have that aluminum adjuvant, you can induce allergies, and it doesn't just give you an allergy to what is in that vaccine vial. The vaccine the vaccine is intended to permanently alter your immune system, and the adjuvant is a toxic ingredient. What they found was, very early on in vaccinology, they found that that live virus vaccines could mutate and restart an epidemic. So they expressed a preference for dead virus vaccines. But the dead virus vaccines, the immune response is not robust enough to get the license. What they discovered very early on, if you add something horrendously toxic to the vaccine, to the dead virus vaccine, it will provoke an immune response that your body will remember ever when it ever sees that antigen, which is the viral particle. So they started a search around the world for the most toxic substances known to man to add to the vaccines in order to provoke that immune response. So it's designed to give you kind of an allergic reaction to what is in that vaccine. And a lot of the vaccines have peanut oil excipients in them. And they have other things that, you don't want allergies to. But what Mawson and Cowlings and Fraser's studies show is that it doesn't just give you an allergy to what's in that syringe. You also get an allergy to things that are in the ambient environment at the time. So if there's a Timothy weed outbreak, when you get that aluminum adjuvant, you may now have a lifetime allergy to Timothy weed. And what Cowling showed in his study is that children who are vaccinated have 30 times the rate of allergic rhinitis compared to children who are unvaccinated. And so, but nobody wants to look at these issues, and and there's all these other injuries that started happening. So now, and I'm not saying vaccines are the only reason we're having chronic disease, but here's what I'm going to say about it, because there's a lot of other stuff. I spend my time litigating against products that operate on the same biological pathways. Glyphosate, which is linked to chronic disease. PFOAs linked to chronic disease. I did the litigation, the Dark Waters case that, Mark Ruffalo, well, that was my case, the first PFOA case. The glyphosate, the Roundup case I was on that trial team. Atrazine, neonicotinoid pesticides, cell phones, EMF radiation, all of these things follow this same timeline. You have to think of something that happened in 1989. It became ubiquitous, affected every demographic from Cubans in Key Biscayne, Miami, to Inuit in Alaska. And you could add something that affect boys, that impact neurological injuries on boys at 4 or 5 times the rate of girls. So, you know, you kind of know what you're looking for. You have the parameters, and then there's a limited number of exposure. We know this comes from environmental exposure, because genes don't cause epidemics. You need an environmental toxin. And you know, the genes could provide a vulnerability, but you need an environmental toxin. So, and there's a limited universe of what it could be that follows that timeline. And, you know, I think it's probably a combination, a conspiracy of all those things, because they're all constantly beating down our immune systems. And finally, you know, one of them will put us over the tipping point. And probably, you know, you could survive a lot of them. And people with a very robust immune system appear to be unaffected, but you don't know. I mean, you know, you can, Phil Landrigan, his great toxicologist, said you could drop IQ for an entire society by 5 points and nobody would know. You know, and you're giving people neurotoxins that are, you know, mercury is 1,000 times more neurotoxic than lead. We inject that into every kid multiple times. And it's still happening in the flu vaccines, which were given to kids every year. So, and you know, aluminum is a neurotoxin. You don't know, when we banned leaded gasoline, IQ jumped up by 1.8 points. Oh, you know, you can dumb down an entire society and nobody's going to notice. And so we in this country have the biggest vaccine schedule. We also have the worst food, you know, toxic food and all these other exposures. We have the biggest, highest chronic disease rate on earth of any country. We have the biggest chronic disease burden. We have the sickest population in the world. And during COVID, we have 4.3% of the globe's population, but we had 16% of the COVID deaths. And that's for a lot of reasons, mainly just really bad management, but also we have the highest chronic disease burden. So, and CDC said that the average American who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had obesity, they had diabetes, they had asthma, and something else. On average, 3.8. And so, you know, they weren't dying. The COVID pushed them off the cliff, but the chronic disease brought them right to the edge of the cliff where they could be easily pushed off. And, you know, we spend now $4.3 trillion annually on healthcare in this country. And 80% of that goes to treat chronic disease. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry, when I was a kid, was making $287 million on vaccines. Now it's about $100 billion a year. But the real money is in the chronic disease that are linked. And by the way, all of those diseases I mentioned, every single one of them is listed as a vaccine side effect on the manufacturer's inserts of those vaccines. And here's what Paul Offit will say is, oh, well, they just throw everything but the kitchen sink on that manufacturer's insert. Why would they do that? Well, because the only way you can sue a vaccine company under FICA is if you can show they knew of a side effect and they failed to list it. So what Offit will say is, yeah, that means they list everything. But that's not true, because there's another federal law that says they cannot list a side effect unless the FDA says that it is highly likely that the vaccine caused that side effect. So they're kind of stuck in a box. And all of those injuries that have suddenly become chronic and epidemic are all listed, so we ought to be looking at those as a potential culprit, right? Among all the other culprits, we need to be looking at it. And we now, and it's bankrupting our country. It's making us, and by the way, it destroys families. It destroys communities. It's destroying our country. We're on track by 2030 to be spending $1 trillion a year. There's a recent study by James Lyons Weiler. Shows $1 trillion the cost of just autism. That's without all of these other chronic diseases. $1 trillion a year. But then you talk to these families who saw regressive autism, where the kids, was exceeding all milestones, and then suddenly they get the vaccines. They go through this predictable cycle of fever, seizure, and then cognitive loss. And these are kids that will never serve in the military. They'll never pay taxes. I'm not talking about all of them, but I'm talking about severe autism. They will never throw a baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never, go on a date, kiss a girl. None of that. And we're doing this to 1 out of every 34 of our kids. And, if you don't think that's criminal. And they know there's people, not everybody in the agency, but there's people in the agency like Frank DeStefano, Colleen Boyle, Anthony Fauci, people, and many others who I can name who know exactly what's happening, and they're lying. And, when I get elected president, I'm going down there. I'm going to move those people out of the agency very, very quickly, and then we're going to start doing the things. We're going to open the databases, which are like the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is the records, the medical records of millions of Americans from the top 10 HMOs. They're all stored in one place. And in those records, you have all the vaccination for everybody who's ever gotten one, and you have all the subsequent medical claims. So you know whether they had to buy diabetes syringes and albuterol inhalers and Adderall and Concerta, anti-seizure medication, antidepressant medication, and this is digitalized. You can do studies in minutes to do cluster analysis with AI, and you can find out the truth. And CDC did a study in 1999 by a scientist, a team led by a Belgian scientist called Thomas Verstraeten. And they went into the Vaccine Safety Data Link and they looked at 450,000 kids who had gotten the vaccine, they looked at one vaccine, hepatitis B. And they looked at the kids who had gotten it within the first 30 days, compared their health impacts, all cause impacts, to kids who did not get it in the first 30 days, so got it later or didn't get it at all. And what they found in their first run of data, before they started messing with it, they found an 11.35 relative risk. That means 1,135% elevated risk of getting an autism diagnosis among the kids who got it in their first 30 days. And they knew right then what was causing the autism epidemic. This was 1999. And they then spent, the rest of the time covering it up and lying about it. And they had a secret meeting, and this is one of the things that got me involved. What they found was that, by the way, 11.35 relative risk. The relative risk for smoking a pack of cigarettes a day for 20 years and getting lung cancer is 10. This is 11.35. And so they knew. And when that study, when those initial results come out, we have now all the emails. And Verstraeten was saying, one of them is titled, "It Just Won't Go Away." an entity saying, we've run the data, we've rerun it, we've eliminated study groups, we've done everything we can. We cannot bury this signal. It is too strong. And they had a secret meeting that with I think there were 52 people there, the vaccine people from WHO, CDC, NIH, FDA, all of the university researchers who that's how they make their living, were the top guys, and they brought them all in for a 2-day meeting, and they didn't want to do it on CDC campus because they would have been susceptible to freedom of information requests. So they did it off campus. They did it at a remote Methodist retreat center called Simpsonwood in Norcross, Georgia, on the wooded banks of the Chattahoochee River. They stayed there 2 days, and somebody made a recording of the meeting, and I got a hold of the transcripts. And that is why I ended up here, because I read those transcripts. You can now go read them on our website, Simpsonwood, but I published excerpts from them on Rolling Stone in 2005. And I was given them, those transcripts, by a public health official in Georgia, Lynn Redwood, whose son was injured by autism, had given tens of thousands of vaccines to people. She realized what she did. And she's been, she's one of the top, most respected health officials in the U.S. history. She's an advisor to the Pentagon, advisor to HHS, but she realized it, and she just gave me those transcripts. And after that, it was, this is what I got to do, because this is so evil, what they're doing. And anyway, I know who's at fault, and I'm going to go in there and change him. I'm going to take that vaccine safety data link, and I'm going to open source it so every scientist in the country can get on it. Yeah. And I'm going to do a lot of other stuff, including signing an executive order reinstating the old rule that pharmaceutical companies cannot advertise on television. Yeah. And I'm going to go down to Bethesda my first week, and I'm going to say, I'm going to get everybody from NIH together, and I'm going to say, we're going to take that $42 billion budget that's going to now do, pharmaceutical development. NIH become an incubator, the biggest incubator for new pharmaceutical products, and that is studying chronic disease to scare the crap out of everybody. That's what they're doing with that money now, looking for viruses all over the world that they can do gain-of-function studies with, and then, whatever they do after that, where we all get sick. You know the punchline already. And I'm going to say then, we're going to give chronic disease a break for a couple of years. We're going to give infectious disease a break for a couple of years. And we're going to start looking at chronic disease. And with that $42 billion that is divided among 56,000 scientists around the world, we're going to tell those scientists and those academicians, now you're going to tell us what is making us the sickest country in the world. Why do we spend 3, 4, 5 times what European countries spend on healthcare, and yet we're 79th in healthcare in outcomes? We're behind Nicaragua. We're behind Mongolia. We're behind Cuba. Why is that? Why is this the sickest generation in American history, and why are we the sickest people on earth, the highest chronic disease burden? Oh, that's what I'm going to get at. And, it's one of the ways the middle class in this country is being destroyed through chronic disease. It's the worst thing that's happened. Because let's say we have an economic collapse. The Fed collapses. BRICS happens. That we lose the dollar as the global currency, and we have a Great Depression, or 5 times the Great Depression. If you are healthy, you can figure it out. And if your child is healthy, you can figure it out. But if you have to carry those burdens, and you have to carry an injured child, we're through as a country. And we are, it's now, there was a statistic that came out about 2 weeks ago that said 1 out of every 7 American kids now has autoimmune disease. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. 6%. And not by 1986, 12.8. So it had doubled. By 2006, 54%. Permanent disabilities. And then NIH stopped doing those studies. We have no idea what it is today, but it's probably around 60%. We're making all of our children sick. So I'm going to put an end to that, and I need your help. I would like, if you guys go to Kennedy24.com, sign up as a volunteer. If you can send us $5, do that. If you can send more, do that. We need to get emails from you and from your friends. Help us get them. Talk to people about what we're doing, and and join the Army, because you guys are the frontline soldiers. Your profession is the profession that really, really cares about public health in this country. And you help me get in there, and I can promise you that I will end the chronic disease epidemic. I've said to people, if I have not significantly reduced chronic disease within my first 3 years, I don't want you to vote for me. And I know I can do it. And I'm going to expose the information that is going to make, even if I can't get the high fructose corn syrup out of our food, I'm going to put enough science out there that everybody who makes high fructose corn syrup is going to face a litigation nightmare from my former colleagues. Anyway, thank you all very much. Please go to Kennedy24.com. If you can send us a contribution, do that, but please join the Army. Thank you all very much. Thank you.